Cease to be deceased. The execution was silent besides a faint rustle of paper. The steady drip of a leaking pipe and the low shuffle of feet were the only sounds to break the tension. Roy Lain lay on the gurney, arms strapped to the sides, the needle poised and ready in his vein. The executioner stood to the right, his face obscured in shadow, while the priest mumbled prayers over Roy's still body. The prisoner's breaths came shallow, his eyes fixed on the ceiling, unblinking. His mind raced back to 13 years of frustration. Yet, here he was. All roads led to this, his name forgotten, his existence erased in the eyes of the state. In the room beyond the glass, his attorney, Anton Zawari, stood and watched. Anton's eyes darted between the clock and the gurney as he fought for a delay, but there was no room for hope now. The executioner nodded to the guard as Roy felt the slow burn of poison creeping into his veins. He exhaled and closed his eyes. Something's wrong. It's not working, a guard said. The executioner's hand trembled. The priest stepped back, his lips frozen mid-prayer. Roy began to breathe rapidly as his heart seemed to seize. What is this, he thought, unable to breathe. The warden frowned, exchanged a glance with the guard and moved towards Roy, who was now unconscious but clearly not dead. Meanwhile, in a hospital room across the country, Nurse Kimberly Maynor stood at the foot of the bed, arms folded, her eyes flicking between the monitors and the woman lying down. Agnes Morgan, her patient for the last 6 months, lay unmoving, chest rising and falling slowly, tethered to this world by only the fragile breath of the ventilator. Across from her, Charlene stood, eyes red, holding onto her sister, Agnes's hand. She hadn't moved since Kimberly entered the room, while Dorothy, Agnes's daughter on the other hand, stood stiff by the window with her arms crossed. The decision had been made. Dorothy, legally in control of her mother's fate, had spoken. And so Kimberly, following orders, was now about to pull the plug and end the life support. She hesitated, fingers hovering before turning the ventilator off. The only thing that could be heard was the sobs of Charlene. What's happening? Kimberly wondered, fiddling with the machine.
Is something wrong, Nurse Maynor?
Charlene asked, noticing Kimberly's confusion. But there was something wrong. Agnes remained breathing. Kimberly glanced at the monitors again, unsure, before saying,
I'm sorry, I'm not sure what happened. It's not working.
Charlene exhaled, a long breath that turned into a whispered prayer.
Thank you, God.
Dorothy's face twisted, a sharp motion as she stormed forward toward Kimberly.
Hey, what's going on? This was supposed to be done today.
I don't know.
Kimberly answered, still fumbling with the machine.
What you mean you don't know? You were supposed to turn it off? That was supposed to be it.
Charlene, her face a mix of disbelief and hope, whispered again.
It's a miracle.
She shouldn't be.
Wait, I'm sorry.
Kimberly interrupted.
I just need to speak with Dr. Cotley. Everything is fine. I need to find her. Just stay here.
She ended before leaving the room. As she walked down the hall, the hospital corridors buzzed with an energy that Kimberly hadn't felt before. Nurses and doctors moved with a kind of urgency as her mind raced. She wove through the shifting bodies, her steps quickening as she scanned for Dr. Cotley. As she rounded a corner, she spotted Derek, her boyfriend. His nurse's scrubs were wrinkled from a long shift, a dark bruise blooming at his temple.
Derek?
She called out, her voice cutting through the increasing sound of the hospital noise.
Oh shoot, hey baby,
he said, turning around and stopping in his tracks. Kimberly ran up saying,
Wow, when did you get that bruise?
After hugging him, she took his head in his hands like a mother would for closer examination, but he drew back, wincing at the pain.
Yeah, got into a big wreck earlier on my break. Felt fine after. Just took a Tylenol. The lady was way worse.
A wreck? Why didn't you tell me?
I feel fine. The other car was totaled. The girl is up in the ICU now. Really messed up. But anyway, I'll head home in about 20.
I'll give you a massage when I get home.
Sounds perfect. But I'm going to sleep as soon as I get in.
Before she could respond, her pager buzzed at her hip. She glanced down at it and read, Meeting in the break room. Dr. Cotley briefing all staff.
Hey, I gotta go,
she said, squeezing his arm.
Get some rest, okay?
Yeah.
He nodded, already stepping away.
Love you and see you later.
After they kissed, she turned toward the break room and approached the door. After pushing it open and stepping in, her gaze immediately drew to the small TV in the corner, where a news broadcaster's voice filled the air. Dr. Cotley stood aside, arms crossed, her face ashen. The nurses gathered around, their faces a mix of shock and confusion, all eyes locked on the screen. As Kimberly joined the group, her heart rate increased as the broadcaster's words washed over her. Reports are flooding in from all over the world. It appears that people are no longer dying, at least not in the conventional sense. Medical experts are baffled as patients who, by all accounts, should be deceased, continue to live. There are confirmed cases of individuals who survived fatal accidents, lethal injuries, and even life support removal. The only known way for death to occur is by decapitation or explosion. A wave of murmurs rippled through the room. The world is in a state of panic as governments scramble to respond. If feeling unwell, we urge you go to the hospital immediately, preferably one with beds, because there have already been instances since this pandemic began that day of people who later became unconscious in situations where they should have died but could have saved themselves had they sought medical care. Make no mistake, this is a global pandemic. It is an emergency. Kimberly's stomach dropped as she caught Dr. Cotley's eye.
We need to prepare for what's coming,
Cotley said, her voice rising over the hum of the TV.
Beds are already up fast and we're at capacity. Only the most serious cases can stay. Everyone else will have to go.
At the prison, the rising tension of chaos surrounded Roy's cell as the distant sound of shouting and clanging metal filled the air. He was awake. His body ached as footsteps approached, echoing down the narrow hallways of Block D. He tried to rise, but he couldn't, his muscles protesting the sudden movement, his head swimming as if he were still trying to wake from a dream. A guard appeared at the cell door, his eyes wide. He fumbled with his keys, clearing his throat as he slid the barred door open. "You're awake. They told me. Well, hell, no one knows what the hell happened. You should be dead." Roy again struggled in vain to sit up.
"What happened? The last thing I remember is the priest talking to me."
"So the injection didn't work. Not the first time this has happened, but anyway, you went under, but no one really knows yet what went wrong."
"So what now? I don't suppose I'm free."
The guard shook his head. "No, it's just delayed. The warden's figuring it out."
"Okay. What's going on around here? Are they rioting?"
Something's going on. Just be glad you're in here," he ended before turning to leave.
"Hey, can I speak to my lawyer?"
"Not now," the guard said, shaking his head. "There's too much happening. You'll stay here until they figure out what to do. No one's getting out, not with the way things are going," he concluded and closed the door behind him. Later that day, an inmate walking by told Roy what was going on. He was even more shocked by this than surviving. Meanwhile, at the hospital, Charlene continued sitting by her sister's bedside. Across the room, Dorothy stood by the window, arms crossed, her body tense.
This can't be happening.
Well, she's still alive. This is a sign.
A sign? It's not a sign, Charlene. She can't keep suffering.
Kimberly walked back in the room, and Charlene's eyes flicked to her before asking,
What are the chances, nurse? Is there a chance she could wake up?
Kimberly hesitated, glancing down at the chart in her hands.
I don't know. At this point, we just have to keep our hopes up.
Isn't there another way? Another way to end this?
No, we'll just have to wait right now.
God'll take care of everything.
Charlene said, to which Dorothy scoffed. Kimberly glanced at the news broadcast on the small television mounted in the corner of the room, where images of chaos flooded the screen. Looting, panic, people across the world struggling to comprehend this new reality. The anchor began. In response to the global phenomenon, some governments are already discussing the reintroduction of guillotines as a method of execution. Religious leaders believe this is a message from God that he will be back soon. Kimberly left and tried to tend to the increasing number of patients entering while the aunt and her niece tried to avoid conflict. On the East Coast, however, Zawari, who was sitting in his office, had been trying to see Roy since the injection failed, but the warden had refused. As the hours passed, the tension in the prison grew, the rumors of death's halt spreading among the prisoners like wildfire. But for Roy, stuck in his cell, it was the silence that gnawed at him most. Outside the prison, Zawari stood in his cramped office, pacing, his phone pressed to his ear. The line to the warden's office rang for what felt like the 100th time. He ran a hand through his hair, his mind racing. Finally, the call connected, and a gravelly voice on the other end greeted him with nothing resembling courtesy. Warden's office.
This is Anton Zawari, Roy Lain's attorney, and I've been trying to reach the warden for days. My client's execution failed, and I've been denied access to speak with him. This is unacceptable.
There was a pause, a long, deliberate silence before the voice responded. The warden's busy. Your client remains in custody under prison protocols. You'll be informed when visitation is allowed. Anton tightened his grip on the phone.
Roy Lain deserves communication with his legal counsel. You can't keep him in isolation like this, especially not under these circumstances. I demand to see him.
The warden's orders are final. There is nothing more to discuss, they ended before hanging up. He stared at the phone in disbelief and slammed the phone down on his desk. Just as Anton was about to call again, his cell buzzed.
Zawari.
He answered. Yes, attorney, a voice on the other end began. This is the assistant from the firm, and I have urgent news regarding the Lain case.
Shoot,
he said, straightening his body. So we just got word that someone has come forward. He also claims to have information about the case.
Wait, let me ensure I'm hearing you right. Someone came forward?
Yes, that's correct. He wants to speak with you. Says it's been eating him alive for years. What the hell is going on, he thought. Someone must be pulling a prank. Either way, this was their last hope. Roy's case hadn't sat well with him, secretly always believing him to be innocent.
I'll meet him. Set it up as soon as possible, please. Preferably today.
Already in motion. I'll let you know the details, they said before hanging up. At the hospital, Charlene stayed next to Agnes's side while Dorothy remained in the waiting room. The room was colder than normal, and just as Charlene got up and was about to ask if the temperature could be turned down, she heard something behind her. It sounded like movement. It was subtle, but it was happening. Agnes was waking up. Her eyelids fluttered while her chest rose and fell more sharply now.
Agnes,
She said, turning back around and quickly approaching her sister before shaking her gently. Her eyes began to open as her fingers twitched again, this time curling slightly as if grasping for something beyond her reach.
I'll be right back. It's okay.
Charlene reassured her sister before running out of the room.
Nurse Maynard! Hey, Nurse Maynard!
She yelled and flung the door open. Charlene continued while running down the hall, and a few minutes later, both her and Kimberly were back in the room. Kimberly leaned closer, watching, waiting until Agnes again stirred, her head shifting ever so slightly on the pillow. The nurse stepped forward before saying,
Oh my God. Agnes, can you hear me?
A faint murmur escaped from her lips, barely audible, her eyelids open, revealing unfocused eyes that struggled to adjust to the light. Kimberly's heart raced.
Talk to us, sister.
Charlene pleaded. Agnes managed to then turn toward her sister and ask,
Where am I?
You're in the hospital. How do you feel?
Agnes's brow furrowed in confusion, her lips parting as if trying to form words, but her throat was still too dry. Kimberly reached for a cup of water on the bedside table, holding it carefully to her lips. She sipped, her throat working slowly to swallow the liquid. As the water eased the dryness in her throat, Agnes turned her gaze back to Kimberly, her eyes clearer now.
I suppose I'm all right now. How long have I been here?
Months.
Kimberly replied, carefully placing the cup back on the table.
You've been in a coma.
Agnes's eyes widened as she looked down at her hands and moved her fingers. A long breath escaped her, and she closed her eyes for a moment, letting the sensation wash over her. Kimberly waited, unsure of what to say before Agnes opened her eyes again, her gaze locking onto Kimberly's.
Where is my daughter?
Oh, she outside. I'll go get her.
Charlene said, turning around.
Wait,
Agnes put a hand up before looking at Kimberly.
I need to tell you something.
She whispered.
Yes, ma'am?
Kimberly leaned in to listen. During the same time, Zawari sat in his office and waited. Suddenly, there was a knock at the door. It was the informant, but what was this all about, really? This better not be a joke, he thought. Seconds later, across from Zawari, James Jules sat hunched in a threadbare chair, his hands clenched together. Initially, he stared at the floor, avoiding Anton's gaze. The lawyer leaned back in his chair, folding his hands together, his eyes fixed on James.
So I understand you have information about the Lain case.
Yeah, man. It's been on my mind for a bit. Quite a bit.
James began to cry.
Mr. Jules, what happened?
James swallowed hard, his voice barely a whisper.
I did it. Roy didn't kill that man. It was me. It wasn't nobody but me.
A silence followed as Anton's eyes narrowed, scrutinizing James.
What do you mean you did it? You don't even live in the area it happened.
James went on to explain how at the time of the murder he was in the area, at the time visiting family. One night, he saw a woman walking and decided to rob her. She fought back and he shot her, taking her purse and all her jewelry. She died instantly. That woman he saw walking from the mall to her car was the sister of a judge. Unfortunately, Roy was also in the area and the only one to run toward the gunshot after hearing her scream. By the time he got there, James was gone. Even more unlucky for Roy. Both he and James had on the same color shirt and were about the same height. Witnesses did the rest, and Roy was promptly convicted. Zawari was shocked before asking,
You're willing to testify under oath?
I have to. I can't live like this anymore. I thought I could bury it, move on, but it's killing me just as much as I did her. I dream about it. Every night. The blood, the look in her eyes when I...
He ended, his voice trailing off.
Okay. You'll testify in court. You'll go before a judge and swear to what you've told me here?
James nodded.
I'll do whatever it takes, sir. Roy didn't deserve what's happened to him. I did. I have to make it right.
Anton stood and walked around the desk, placing a hand on James's shoulder, feeling the man tremble beneath his touch.
You're doing the right thing.
He reassured him, leaning over to look in his eyes.
But you know this isn't just going to be about clearing Roy's name. You'll face charges. You'll have to answer for what you did. The good news is that now, in light of recent events, no one's getting the death penalty.
James looked up and replied,
I know. I deserve it.
Anton let his hand drop, stepping back and returning to his seat. He took a long breath, allowing himself a moment to process everything.
All right. I'll file the paperwork first thing in the morning. Get the judge on this right away. We'll make sure Roy walks out of there.
Thank you.
James whispered, hands still trembling. Anton stood again, shoving the papers and slipping them into his briefcase. He paused for a moment, glancing back at James.
Go home. Get some rest. I'll be in touch with the next steps. Just please remember to answer your phone.
James nodded and rose slowly.
I want to make it right.
He finished before turning and shuffling toward the door. As the door closed behind James, Anton sat back down, exhaling a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. At the hospital, the nurse was shocked by what her patient told her. Charlene was just as amazed but equally angry. Soon after, Kimberly left, returning with 2 police officers. Following Agnes's account of what happened, the officers turned and walked down the hall toward the hospital waiting room. This is where they find Dorothy, who sat with her phone in hand, unaware of the men approaching. That is until they stopped directly in front of her. She looked up, her eyes wide. Dorothy Burns, you need to come with us, one of the officers said. Please put your hands behind your back. Dorothy's brow furrowed as her eyes darted.
What? What are you talking about?
The other officer stepped forward before pulling out a pair of handcuffs and saying, You're under arrest. The secret Agnes had wanted to tell. It wasn't about her miraculous survival or her seeing the afterlife or talking to God or anything like that. The truth was, Dorothy hadn't wanted her mother to wake up, not because of some vague hope of peace, but because she was hiding something. Agnes's own daughter wanted to cash in on her life insurance policy as well as take the house. She had been secretly withholding her mother's medication for weeks before Agnes went into a coma. As she was cuffed and led away, her protests echoing down the hallway, Kimberly turned back to Charlene.
I knew my niece wasn't shit,
she said, shaking her head. Shortly after, across the nation, the rioting in Roy's prison was beginning to grow out of control. Zawari had just gotten off the phone with the warden, after forwarding information from the judge. In light of new evidence, there was a hold placed on Lain's execution, as if it could be done through lethal injection anyway. The warden was not pleased but had no choice. That night, Roy sat on the edge of his cot, staring at the peeling concrete walls. He could barely hear the sound of footsteps echoing down the hallway toward him. Roy's head, startled, snapped up to see the door to his cell swing open. A guard stood there, staring before saying, "Come with me." Roy stood and followed the guard down the long corridor, past the rows of cells where men yelled, spat, and threw feces. As they reached the end of the hallway, Roy was led through the thick metal door and into the visiting room. There, sitting at the long table, was Zawari. "What's going on?" Lain thought, as he smiled and walked toward his attorney. Anton stood up, smiling as well as Roy was led to a chair opposite him. The guard remained by the door, watching but saying nothing. The two men took a seat after shaking hands. The attorney didn't waste time.
"You're going to be a free man, Mr. Lain. It's over."
What?
He asked, opening his hand and cocking his head to the side. Anton leaned forward, sliding a thick envelope across the table.
A man named James Jules came forward. He confessed. The courts reviewed the evidence, and let's just say, I feel pretty good about your chances. You're going home.
Roy stared at the envelope, his heart pounding in his chest. He didn't know how to feel. His entire body shook as he reached for the envelope, pulling it closer and opening it.
James Jules?
Roy asked. Anton nodded. Apparently he couldn't live with the guilt any longer. Came forward, confessed to everything. If everything holds up, you're set to be clear of all the charges. Roy's breath hitched, his chest tightening as a tear rolled down his eye.
I'm getting out?
That's right, Roy.
Anton replied.
It's over.
Roy sat back in the chair, his hands still clutching the envelope, mouth agape, and looked past the attorney in thought. He wasn't sure how to react.
So what do I do now?
Well, you'll have to wait here for a few weeks, maybe even months, but we'll get it done.
Zawari assured him. Soon, that one single tear turned to many before Roy looked up and said,
Thank you. Thank you so much.
No hugging, the guard yelled, stopping the men's embrace.
Don't worry about it. We'll get you out of here soon.
He ended before leaving. As Roy was escorted back toward the exit, the door swung open before him. He paused, his breath catching in his throat. For the first time in 13 years, he had hope. An hour after Roy was told the good news, Kimberly had been stuck dealing with multiple patients in a chaotic hospital. She moved through the crowded corridors from patient to patient, her mind still on Agnes's situation, but not too much time to think about what happened because they were filled to capacity within hours. Patients lined the hallways, their faces pale and drawn, many who should be dead but just weren't. She passed makeshift triage centers in the parking lot. Doctors and nurses scrambling to manage the unmanageable, the air heavy with exhaustion. Everywhere, the same story played out. People who should have died from accidents, strokes, and terminal illnesses still clung to life, or whatever life remained. The rules of death had been rewritten, and no one knew how or why. Kimberly paused, wiping the sweat from her forehead, her eyes scanning the rampant scene around her. Luckily, she would be off in minutes.
Hey, Nurse Maynor.
A voice called from behind. It was Dr. Cotley. Kimberly hurried toward her while weaving through gurneys and medical staff.
Dr. Cotley.
She called as she approached.
Maynor, what happened with the Morgan patient?
Oh, I'm so sorry. Been incredibly busy, but she woke up.
She woke up?
She asked, raising an eyebrow.
Yes, doctor. She's conscious, and her vitals are improving.
That's impossible.
That's what I thought, but it's true.
Kimberly began before going into the family debacle.
Oh, that's right. I did hear about police, but I was busy organizing the lot. Well, glad you took care of it. Thank you.
Kimberly nodded.
Oh, and by the way, I wanted to ask you something. Feel free to say no, but do you think you can handle a double shift tomorrow? We're stretched thin, as you know, and I need everyone I can get.
Of course.
She replied, aware of the need but already regretting her decision.
Good. We'll make it through this, somehow. Oh, and do you think you could ask Derek when you get home as well? I texted him but didn't receive an answer.
Oh yeah, he's exhausted, but I will ask.
Great. Get some rest.
Cotley ended before returning to the mayhem. 30 minutes later, Kimberly was home. The key turned in the lock with a quiet click and she pushed open the door to the apartment. Aside from the television in the living room, their home was quiet as she closed the door behind her and set her bag down by the entrance. The soft glow of the screen spilled into the hallway, and she moved toward the kitchen for a glass of wine.
Hey, babe, you sleep?
She called. Apparently he was, as he lay on the couch, passed out with his head turned slightly toward the window. His chest rose and fell softly, his face serene.
Derek?
She called softly, stepping closer. She had planned to wake him gently, to maybe offer the massage she promised earlier, but as she moved closer, a cold shiver ran down her spine.
Derek?
Her voice wavered as she reached out, her fingers brushing his shoulder. He didn't stir. She crouched beside him, her hand pressing gently against his chest. The rise and fall was there. Faint. Too faint. A strange tightness pulled at her gut as she pressed two fingers to his neck, searching for the steady pulse she knew should be there. But it was slow. Too slow. Panic gripped her, sudden and fierce.
Derek, wake up!
He didn't respond. Kimberly's heart pounded as she knelt over him, shaking him gently, then harder.
Derek!
She began to panic. Her hands trembled as she pulled out her phone, dialing emergency services with shaking fingers. The seconds stretched endlessly as the phone rang, her pulse hammering in her ears. 911, what is your emergency? Came the voice on the other end.
Yes. Hello. I just got home and Derek, my boyfriend, I found him on the couch. He's unconscious. He won't wake up. Please hurry.
Please stay calm, ma'am, the voice said. We'll send an ambulance right away. Keep monitoring his pulse. Kimberly knelt beside him, her hands pressed against his chest as if the very act of touch could bring him back. Derek wasn't dead, but he was close to it, caught in that strange place between life and death, just like so many others she had seen today. Only now it was personal. When the paramedics finally arrived, over 30 minutes later, Kimberly stood, her body moving on autopilot as she explained again what had happened. She watched as they moved Derek onto the stretcher, as they secured and wheeled him out of the apartment. Turns out, the wreck he was in earlier should have killed him, but only knocked him out momentarily. The bruise on his head masked the more serious issue he had unknowingly been dealing with throughout that day. He had a brain bleed, and once he went home to sleep, he too faded into a coma. Kimberly knew that nothing would ever be the same.